Hello and welcome everybody to Comp and Coffee. I'm Ruth Thomas, Chief Evangelist here at PayScale and the current custodian of the podcast. Well, we're recording this at the end of January, which is a month that always feels very long and also seems to be a month where there's a lot to get done and get organised for the year. I'm sure if you've been locked away or you're preparing for compensation processes, it's been an equally long month. There's been quite a lot going on from a legislative perspective this month. There's been a few states talking about pay transparency laws, and we did a webinar this week covering that. But what we wanted to focus on today was the whole topic of minimum wages. And that's because we've seen a number of US states boosting their minimum wage rates this month, and with more planned later on this year. So we thought that's what we would spend this episode talking about. And joining me for this discussion are Vicky Peatman, Director of Product, Lulu Sakeley, who is Senior Corporate Attorney, and Kim Taylor, who's Vice President of Compensation Services. So welcome, ladies, to all three of you. And I'm looking forward to hearing your perspectives on this topic. So let's get going because there's quite a lot to talk about. Can you just each introduce yourselves? I'm going to pass the baton to Vicky first. Can you tell me where you're calling from and what's your role here at PayScale?
Hi, Ruth. I'm in not so sunny Edinburgh today. I am Director of Product here at PayScale. At the moment, I am covering some of our data products, which is quite exciting. I look into how to improve them and make sure that they're useful for all of our customers.
Thank you. Kim, over to you.
Hi, Ruth. Thanks for having me today. I'm calling in from Boston, Massachusetts, and in my role as the VP of Compensation Services here at PayScale, I work with a team of consultants who help our clients develop and implement their compensation strategies internally.
Thank you. And Lulu, would you like to tell us about yourself and where you're calling from?
Hi, everyone. Everyone on this podcast is very jealous that I'm calling in from very sunny but quite cold Dallas, Texas. I am the Senior Corporate Employment Attorney here at PayScale. So outside of my role as in-house employment advisor to PayScale, I work very closely with Ruth and team tracking all things legislation. So we'll be talking about the minimum wage laws on this podcast here shortly.
Thank you. Right. So there's quite a lot, as I said, to cover here. We're mainly going to be talking about minimum wages in the US because that's where we've seen these changes taking effect this month. But Kim, can you start us off with a bit of background about the whole history of the minimum wage in the US and how it's come about?
Yeah, absolutely. So the national federal minimum wage here in the United States was enacted in 1938, and it was designed as a way to help the US recovery from the Great Depression. At the time, it was 25 cents an hour. And as I mentioned, it was designed to be a tool of shared recovery and introduced for the first time a national floor on wages with the dual aims of both alleviating poverty and boosting the economy by driving consumer spending. And by all accounts, it was successful at this. Now, if you fast forward quite a bit to today, we are now in the longest period in history with no federal minimum wage increase. There's been no increase since 2009, and we are currently sitting at $7.25 an hour. Now, when you adjust that for inflation, the federal minimum wage last summer reached its lowest level since 1956. This failure to raise the federal minimum wage has been inspiring this Fight for $15 campaign, which started in November of 2012, which is proposing that the federal minimum wage be raised to $15 an hour by 2024, which is this year.
So we've seen then a number of states, Lulu, who have increased their minimum wage floors, and some of them have obviously now gone past that $15 an hour. But can you take me through the specific changes that have been effective this month, Lulu?
So this year, this was the big headline on the minimum wage front, but this year we're going to see, or we've already seen a good chunk of the 25 states and 38 cities and counties who have either already increased their minimum wage as of January 1, or they're going to increase their minimum wage later on in the year. So as of January 1st, we saw over 9.9 million, with an M, million workers receive an automatic pay increase. So as a reminder, and we get questions like this all the time, what the heck am I supposed to pay my employees? There's the federal minimum wage, there's the state minimum wages I have to comply with, there are the city minimum wages. The minimum wage that you have to pay is how much you pay that employee in the location which they're working in. So as an example, let's say you have hourly workers at Google. Google headquarters is located in Mountain View, California. And so you're looking at me and you're saying, hey, Lulu, the federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. California's minimum wage now is $16 an hour. But the city of Mountain View, their minimum wage is $18.75 an hour. Do I get to pick which wage I pay? No. You do not get to pick which wage you pay. You have to pay the Mountain View minimum wage of $18.75 per hour, as an example. So I sit in Dallas, Texas. In Texas, we don't have a state minimum wage like California, like Washington, like other states have. So if you work in Texas, the minimum wage you have to pay your employees is the federal one, which currently, like Kim mentioned, sits at $7.25 an hour, hasn't budged for quite some time. Hasn't budged since I, just graduated college, to give everyone kind of an idea of what that looks like. So because the federal minimum wage hasn't budged in so long, a lot of states, a lot of cities have said, hey, we're going to raise our own local minimum wages because our cost of living, like in the Mountain View, Californias of the world, have increased so much that folks can't live on $7.25 an hour anymore. So this has garnered a lot of widespread public support, across the political party lines here in the US.
Right. And is that federal legislation? I mean, that's a long time, for any change. Is that likely to change anytime soon? What's going on kind of on the national stage there?
We're hoping. I mean, unfortunately, federal minimum wage is a very political sort of idea here. I'm going to walk y'all through just what's been happening over the past few years, just to show, there have been our lawmakers are thinking about it, which is great. There just hasn't been a lot of budging, unfortunately. So in 2019, there was a bill proposed and actually passed in the U.S. House of Representatives to increase the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. So that didn't go anywhere, unfortunately. I think Kim mentioned that already. Then we saw something in 2021. The Democrats proposed the Raise the Wage Act bill. So this bill was proposed to gradually increase the minimum wage to $12.25 an hour by 2025. Bill didn't pass. It died, didn't go anywhere. Then we saw in 2023, we saw two new bills, both proposed in the United States Senate. One on the Democratic side by Senator Bernie Sanders and Senator Scott. They proposed to raise the federal minimum wage to $17 an hour by 2028. So that's a 5-year timeline to get from $7.25 an hour to $17 an hour. We saw another bill proposed by the Republican side of the Senate. This was proposed by Senators Romney, Cotton, Cassidy, Collins, Shelley Moore Capito, and Vance. And they proposed a gradual rate increase to $11 an hour with future increases tied to inflation. So I don't think either of those bills are going to go anywhere, unfortunately, in the next few months. As a reminder, if y'all are living under a rock, there is an election this year, a pretty big election this year on the US side. So what that means is that we may see a change in the United States House of Representatives in terms of who's controlling it. Same with the United States Senate. So depending what happens there, either we could see a really luscious, great bipartisan bill proposed and passed in 2025, or we could see it being stalled again.
So we've now got the situation with no federal minimum wage. You've got different states passing different levels of minimum wage. If you're in a state that hasn't passed a minimum wage law, what should you be doing, Lulu? Should you be paying close attention to what other states are doing? Should you be following suit and naturally giving employees higher wages? What's your thoughts on that?
So those of y'all who follow our Pay Transparency series, I'm saying something very similar. So no, I'm not. We didn't just take a clip from a prior webinar and plug it into the minimum wage podcast, I promise. But it's the same sort of mentality, right? Is that if you are an employer in Texas, for example, you're only obligated to pay $7.25 an hour, which of course has to be annualized if you're paying salaried employees too, right? But if you're really trying to attract and retain workers and the best kind of workers, start paying attention to what your competitors are doing potentially in other states. If you're working in tech in Austin and you're trying to attract folks for $7.25 an hour, you're probably not having a pretty easy time doing that, right? Because at Google in Mountain View, they're paying $18.75 an hour. So you have to kind of see what other states are doing, what your competitors are doing in the sense of how do I attract and retain the best talent? Then we always get the idea of, well, what about remote workers? How the heck am I supposed to pay my employees if they're sitting in all 50 states? Well, you're going to have to pay your employees the minimum wage of where they're working. So if you have employees working in Mountain View, California, but you're based in Austin, Texas, you can't pay that Mountain View, California employee $7.25 an hour. You got to pay them the $18.75 an hour that they're working in Mountain View. So, and we're also seeing a lot of our customers, they're trying to create more consistent practices, right? So they're saying, we have half of our customers saying we're going to pay based on location. We have the other half saying we're going to pay regardless of where they live, as long as we meet the minimum wage requirements. And we're seeing that in terms of their compensation philosophy and practices, that paying one level base, as long as it complies with, the highest minimum wage that they have to comply with, seems to be a great strategy for them.
Yeah, I'm going to share some CBPR data later, which talks to that point. Now, we had another interesting, there are so many questions, technical questions about the minimum wage, but I think one question that we saw come in this week, Vicky, from a customer was the impact of minimum wages on market rates and on, for example, our pay data here that we supply at PayScale. Can we see the impact, for example, of like these minimum wage increases in our data?
Yes, we can. It does take a little while to flow through to the market data. So if you can imagine like our peer products, then the companies are updating their data on a monthly basis, which means that after they pay that January, we would get that data, but it doesn't come in until 90 days after due to the guidelines. And so you won't see it, but we do see it in the data. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the same with a third-party surveys, which are the traditional surveys. You might see them, but on an annual basis, obviously, because they're putting it. But it is their HRS data that they're feeding through, so it will come through. I think the other thing to consider, Lulu's point was really, really correct, is that some companies are deciding to pay across the board. So if they're a company who's like, we're going to have a minimum wage for ourselves, then they're going to pay in Texas the same as they pay in California. And so you will see that pushing up rates in states that you don't have the impact. So when we're kind of looking, we might be like, well, hold on, why is it that Texas is also rising at this, California's maybe rising faster, but that's what we're seeing is it impacts. The other thing that's quite interesting is that there's a lot of companies that pay national level, or they pay a differential off the national rate. And so again, if you're doing kind of the average or the median across all of the data across all the states, then you're going to pick those increases of minimum wage across the different states up into the national rate, and then you're going to feed it through into it. So you definitely see it in the data, but it's not as obvious, and there's a bit of a lack.
It's interesting that point though about if companies adopt this consistently as best practice across the locations which they operate. That may be another trend where we see, we took this talk about moving to national rate across the board, and that may be another factor that could be influencing that.
Yeah, I mean, with all these different things, right, we're going to have all the pay rate legislation things. We've got the minimum wages, and they're all different across. I mean, particularly if you've got remote workers or you've got lots of different sites, it's too complicated to deal with, like all of the different, and try to kind of, so actually coming to a sort of consistent philosophy and trying to work that out makes it so much more simple and easy to explain and transparent, definitely.
Yeah. So we've been talking about the minimum wage. Let's mention the living wage. How does that factor in here? Now, you and I in the UK are more familiar with the term, the living wage, because it's a bit more prevalent in terms of its adoption here. Vicky, can you just kind of give me an explanation of the difference between those two terms?
Yeah, so minimum wage is usually the required rate that is provided by the legislation wherever you are. Whereas the living wage is a rate that's calculated that will allow a worker or a household to afford its basic needs, such as housing, food, healthcare, transportation. And it's calculated by different groups in different places around the world. In the US, there's a living wage calculator that's used by the MIT, calculated by the MIT, which is actually quite a good one. And for example, if you look at Washington, D.C., which has got the highest minimum wage, it's $17 is their minimum wage in Washington, D.C. That's about 60% of what an individual in a household with two adults who are working and two children would need to earn to meet their basic family needs. So you can see that the minimum wage is high, but it's not going to meet the living wage. Within the US, there's no sort of no concrete sum, varies depending on whether or not the number of people in your household and the number of people working in your household. In the UK, as you say, it's slightly different in that they work it out, they sort of average it out, and they provide one number for the UK as a whole and another number for London specifically. With each of these, they're voluntary amounts, so it's not enforced by legislation. In terms of how many people take it up, in the US, it's not a huge number. I couldn't actually find that many companies that declare that they're a living wage employer. So in the UK, there are 14,000 businesses that declare they're a living wage employer. Whereas in the US, companies like Costco are actually determined by others as living wage employers, but they use the phrase, we pay fair wages on their website. So the company there's an organization called Just, which has a framework for ESG and things like that. They look at the different companies and they determine which companies kind of are living wage employers. And they've got sort of 4 or 5 that sort of they can say. But financial services, often they're paying it, but they're kind of paying it anyway. I think it's the companies it matters for are the ones where they're at the minimum wage level.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for explaining that difference. Okay, so let's go back to the minimum wage. Kim, what are the benefits to businesses of paying these higher than federal minimum wages?
Sure. So one of the key arguments for raising the federal minimum wage harkens back to the reason that the federal minimum wage was created in the first place. And that's the logic that it is good not only for the employees that are being paid, but for the businesses themselves. Our employees are ultimately consumers. And here in the US, about 70% of our economy is consumer driven. So the reasoning there is that if you put more money in people's pockets, they're going to have more money to go out and then spend in turn. There's also an argument that employees who are going to be more satisfied with a higher rate of pay, and that will boost engagement, retention, innovation, and productivity. And then lastly, we do see that lower pay is tied to high employee turnover. And we know that employee turnover has an impact on the business's costs in the form of recruitment costs, retention costs, lost productivity costs. And so one of the third arguments around raising the minimum wage is that the morale increase that it drives is going to help boost productivity, retention, and innovation once again.
Right. So lots of good reasons for considering doing this. There's a broader ESG angle here too, Vicky. I know you and I have looked at this before. How would you describe how increasing the minimum wage would be a good thing to do as part of your environmental, social, and governance policy?
Yeah, so this is part of the S, the social pillar, and it's all about people, basically. It's all about how you look after your workers, your people who work for you. And there's lots of different elements, and we've talked about it before. Pay equity obviously comes into that too. The issue that a lot of companies have with ESG in particular is how do you kind of put a value on things like you say, oh, well, we're very caring about our well-being of our employees. That's really quite hard to kind of have any kind of put a number to it and sort of quantify it. And so actually minimum wage or living wage is a way in which you can actually quantify, like, what is the difference between the minimum wage floor and what we're paying, which is what we're kind of almost like, this is what we care, how much we care about our employees. So that's, I think, like where it fits in. Obviously, as well as that, it generates that kind of social impact that Kim was just talking about. It shows that you're a good business. It's putting money into people's pockets. And so it sends out a kind of strong message that you care and you're a responsible business.
Right. So that's interesting, though, because we're quite often, if people are proactively trying to activate their ESG policy, often struggle to find decent metrics underneath that social pillar. So it's worth thinking about it in terms of a metric to show how you are, that you're doing something and having an impact. So,
exactly.
So the other thing I hear a lot about, and been sort of in some of the thought leadership sessions I've been working on, is, okay, this is all great. We know it's good for business, but at the same time, we're in a certain period of economic volatility, and this essentially equates to increasing costs in our business and concern over how do we afford that as a business, particularly with this, the number of legislations coming through that Lulu's been telling us about. And I think, normally the discussion is around well, there's kind of a number of options. You're either going to increase this out of profits, you're going to potentially pass the increased cost on to consumers through higher prices, or potentially you're going to seek to reduce costs elsewhere in the business, for example, doing job cuts. So those are the three kind of options that I've heard talked about. In the UK, we do have some government data on this, and it shows that in the last 2 years, the frequency has really been price pass through. So businesses have really been increasing prices as a way to cover these minimum wage costs. Not a surprise in the context of the broad-based increases that we've seen and the rising inflation that we've had. But as that pivots, and hopefully, going into 2024 and beyond, we will start to see cost of living going down, inflation going down. It may be, more difficult to actually pass that on to the customers. For larger businesses, they have often more generous profit margins, I guess. So you could consider this is the price of conducting socially responsible business under the ESG kind of umbrella. And then for smaller businesses, it can obviously be more of a challenge because it may not be as affordable. Vicky, there's some research out there, I think, around how the minimum wage actually impacts inflation. Can you share some of the insights that you got on that?
Yeah, so it is quite interesting because that's the immediate assumption, is that you're going to increase pay and it feeds through to inflation. And obviously in the 70s, you saw the wage price spiral and everyone kind of got crazy. And so the question is whether or not that's actually kind of borne out. And there's quite a lot of research out there about this. And generally the consensus is that it has a minimal impact on how companies price their goods, and therefore does not materially cause inflation. Now, at the moment, we've got that kind of tricky situation with the prices are already increasing because, energy prices have increased and other issues. And so they're already cutting that to the profits in. Like, can they also do it? Is it going to be the same in this year as it has been in the past? Like, obviously, we don't know that. The UK government assessment for this year, and this is UK, if firms passed on 100% of the cost, which is improbable, then it would have a very small impact on overall inflation, increasing it by up to 0.3 percentage points. And obviously that's because you're talking about a smaller group of people. The rest of the pay might not be actually impacted. This is only the pay of the minimum wage. We're not talking about all the differentials and all the things, other impacts. And so, but I do want to just say that one of the things that research has also shown is that it doesn't relate to job cuts as well. One of these article that we were having a look at earlier on that said it doesn't kill jobs, but it kills job vacancies because it decreases turnover. And so actually supposed to be a good thing for business. And therefore, because it obviously the cost of hiring is way more than the cost of retention. And so, actually it might not end up being impacting your total costs of your pay, depending on the price increase, the minimum wage increase. And there's also downstream benefit. Family income is highly correlated with mental and physical health, child development and school achievement, civic engagement, and many other dimensions of individual and social well-being. And so there's a lot of things that it does seem to have a benefit for, but the pinch is at that point when you have to suddenly increase wages.
Right. So I think if you're in the position as a HR practitioner or a comp practitioner and your business leaders are saying, we can't afford this, just spend some time kind of thinking about the broader issues here and some of the things that we've been discussing. But there's a very practical compensation problem that often occurs as a result of minimum wages, Kim, and I'm going to come back to you to talk about this, and that is pay compression. So as employees at the lower end of the wage spectrum get pay hikes, then this can bring them closer to employees in grades above them. We had pay compression, obviously, during the Great Resignation with new hires coming in. Is this going to be a big problem? Are you talking about it with customers? And how do we solve that problem, Kim?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a huge issue and one that we hear a lot about from our clients when we're working through minimum wage increases. You have a risk of compression anytime the growth in a market rate outpaces what you're increasing your internal employee salaries at. And when you look at minimum wage increases, they do typically exceed salary growth inside of an organization. So I'm going to use a little example close to home as an example of that. In 2023, here in Massachusetts, increased the statewide minimum wage to $15 an hour. Prior to that increase, it was $14.25. And if you do that math, it's just a tick over 5% increase. Those of us in compensation know that annual salary increase budgets are generally in the 3% range or so. So you can see that there's about a 2 percentage point delta difference between the minimum wage increase and everyone else's increases. And that, of course, is going to be exacerbated when you have multiple minimum wage increases over the course of several years, which you do often see. And so, of course, you can't afford to give everyone a 5% increase. If you did, that would be a fantastic way to solve the compression issue, but that's just not feasible. And so over time, we see that the employees at that minimum wage tend to creep up alongside the rates that are being paid to people who are maybe more tenured or perhaps even their supervisors. And so the way that we typically recommend tackling this is first, reevaluate all your jobs that are at the minimum wage or kind of minimum wage adjacent to make sure that you're paying them the actual market rate and they're in a grade that reflects what the actual market value of those positions are. You might have to reclassify some of them as a result of these minimum wage increases. You might need to think about whether or not you can add some value to the jobs to justify a slightly higher pay wage, I guess, than what you've been paying currently. Look for any areas where you can introduce an operational efficiency or develop some knowledge, skill, or ability to better justify that increase in wage for these employees. And then from a practical perspective, I look to, I guess, incrementally decrease those increases as you move up the organization. So back to that Massachusetts example, if your Massachusetts minimum wage employees are seeing a 5% year over year increase, maybe the next level up sees a 4.5% increase, and then a 4%, and then a 3.5% increase, and decrease it as you go up your organization's hierarchy. So by the time you get up a few levels, you're back around the normal salary growth that you would expect to see. And then one nice thing that I just want to call out is that generally these minimum wage increases are legislated fairly well in advance. So most companies do have a little bit of advanced knowledge that something is coming. I like to tell my clients, plan it out as much as possible, maybe even model out what your structure might look like next year, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, knowing what you do about how the increases are going to roll out, just to get ahead of it and be on top of any changes that might be forthcoming.
Great, thank you. Well, lots of good tips there. It does remind me, I know in the UK we've seen, particularly within the retail sector, which is one of those that are more impacted often by minimum wage rates, is we've seen allocation of pay budgets has been more towards staff or employees at the lower end of the wage spectrum and potentially executives. I mean, I know for a couple of years, executives in some of the firms weren't getting any increases and they were just putting the salary budget down to that lower end of the wage spectrum in order to work through some of the changes that are happening there. So lots to think about with minimum wages. I'm currently working with my team on the new compensation best practice report data. We're busy reading that in the background. But just to give you a quick sneak peek, according to the latest data, which we'll be releasing in March, 27% of organisations say that their comp strategy will be impacted by the minimum wage increases that Lulu was telling us about. But then there's still a significant portion who aren't worried about the effect of rising minimum wages on their comp strategy. And that's because either they don't employ minimum wage employees or because their floor wage is above the minimum wage. So that's probably, Lulu, going back to your point around, the best practice perspective. So 36% of respondents, we have 5,000 respondents or 5,700 respondents, sorry, should be get the number absolutely correct, to this year's CBPR. 36% of those said their floor wage was above the minimum wage. So I always like to call out that best practice. Anything else anybody wants to chime in here on minimum wage before we close out? Any more thoughts or tips? What about, did we talk about wealth equality, Vicky? That was one thing we were going to talk about.
Can't get away without me mentioning a little bit about wealth inequality. I think one of the things that minimum wage is actually, you'd hope would impact is wealth inequality, because particularly if you're one of those companies that is increasing the lower levels at a higher rate than the higher levels in your organization, then you would be a company where you'd see maybe your CEO pay ratios decrease, which would be great and in line with trying to reduce inequality. Overall, though, we're not seeing that minimum wage is actually impacting wealth inequality in the US. And mainly that's because what we're talking about is income, whereas wealth also includes real estate shares, like all dividends, all the things. And so actually at the upper levels, the wealthiest, they're increasing faster. And it's usually because of other things rather than income. And so whereas you might see the income levels getting closer together, then wealth, unfortunately, is not as hugely impacted. But, there's still time.
And if they're a pay scale customer, Kim, can they come to you and the services team for help if they need to?
Absolutely. We love tackling these questions. It's a complex issue and it's fun to puzzle apart.
And then, Lulu, we will be aiming to keep PayScale's customers up to date with these legislation changes. I don't think we've got this stuff on our PayLedge page at the moment, do we?
No, we don't. But that is a goal for this year, is to get some sort of chart showing each state's, at least on the state level. The cities, I think, is going to be too cumbersome or burdensome. So my goal is to have some sort of chart on the landing page of minimum wage by state for the next 3 years. So from 2024 through 2026. So I'll be working closely with Vicky and her team on making sure that happens. So stay tuned.
I was just going to say, if you do have pay factors, then there is already a map in pay factors that has all that information and some of the upcoming legislation as well, which is quite cool, which is in the data insights tab.
Oh, right. Thanks for pointing that out. Well, that was quite a lot we covered here today. There is a PayScale minimum wage report underneath our research and insights section on payscale.com as well. That was written last year. It covers a lot of kind of the background, the history that we've talked about, the four of us here today. We'll probably be updating that again this year. It's a report that we update regularly. But as I said, the PayScale minimum wage report you can find underneath research and insights. So what do you think? Do you have any more questions about minimum wage that we haven't answered today? If you do, then let us know. And if you think there's something we've missed or there's another topic that you'd like us to talk about, then let us know also. Thank you very much, Lulu, Kim, and Vicky, for joining me today to talk about this. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.